Hello friends, Naya Swami Riemann here, and this week I'd like to ask the question, is it wrong to be happy? There's a quote from Jean-Paul Sartre, the nihilist existentialist, who wrote, "In this world that bleeds, all joy is obscene." Now it's true that if your friend is grieving or sad, you're not going to be around this person, poking him in the ribs and cracking jokes. Of course, if someone is suffering, a friend of yours, you cannot help but feel sad. But for all the suffering that exists in the world, should we walk about with our heads down and feeling the great tragedies of life? And yet, there's a certain amount of common sense to that, or at least how can we be happy when there is so much suffering? That's the question, isn't it? And it's made worse by those of us who attune ourselves to the Eastern teachings and concepts like the law of duality, in which we say it all balances to zero. Your pleasures, your joys, your successes all end up adding up to zero by virtue of their counterparts, their opposites. That's a pretty grim assessment of life. Should we therefore chop wood and carry water like buffaloes or long-suffering camels? How do we resolve what seems like at least a logical dilemma? The Adi Shankaracharya, in the latter half of the first millennia of the Common Era, Swami Shankara, quoted ancient texts and revelations in describing the goal of life and the very nature of God and of reality itself as Sat Chitanandam, describing God as ever existing, meaning immortal, ever conscious, meaning omniscient and eminent, ever present, all omnipresent, and ever new bliss. Yogananda added the phrase ever new. So how do we reconcile being made in the image of God? How do we reconcile what seems like an irreconcilable contrast between sorrow and our desire or our instinct for joy? In describing the very nature of reality, which we can call God, we can call our soul, we can call our own very instincts, if the very nature of reality is conscious bliss, super conscious bliss, I think that holds the possibility of reconciliation. For you see, the happiness we seek as an offset to the sorrow we want to avoid is in fact dual, and it's a treadmill. We're like little squirrels. But the instinct to find happiness is universal and deeply embedded in the nature of reality. It's just that we're looking for that happiness in all the wrong places. Does that mean we become an anchorite and we walk away from our life and walk around in rags, perhaps begging or just ignoring the needs of the body and the realities of the world around us? Well, some people have done that, certainly. Buddha tried that, and he found it wasn't all that successful, meaning adopting extreme measures against the very impulses of the body in which we inhabit and the world in which we inhabit doesn't do it either. That's still relative. The Satchidanandam, that is the nature of reality, and which provides our instinct to find that nature as bliss, is within us. It's the nature of consciousness when it achieves stillness, quietude, not passivity, not blankness, not a trance, but an upliftment of awareness that is unconditioned by the parameters of relativity, unconditioned by the very nature of the restlessness and needs of the body, or the likes and dislikes, or the circumstances that surround us. Now that too is extremely tall order given the consciousness of most human beings, which is why faith traditions encourage us to seek at least virtue. Virtue, you see, may be relative to vice, but it still brings a greater degree of satisfaction, a longer lasting form of happiness. When we give and we share, when we're connected with other people, when we take into account their needs and their sorrows and their joys and so forth, we expand our consciousness beyond the demands and the needs of this physical form and the ego which inhabits it and wants to protect it. So it is relative, but it is still relatively closer to the permanent, eternal, unchanging state of our soul. Now, you can go for endless lifetimes, I suppose, living that way, being virtuous, that is to say, even-minded and cheerful. That's wonderful. But nonetheless, the soul yearns for absolute, yearns for a permanent state of happiness. And though very few people are willing to put out the energy and commitment to achieve that state through the spiritual practices of meditation and more energetic self-giving and devotion to the Supreme Lord, nonetheless, that will, in time at least, should we pursue the road of virtue, will begin to tug at our heartstrings and invite us to transcend the dualities of the creation. This is the destiny of our souls. This is the purpose for the creation, that we unmask the man behind the curtain, the consciousness behind all things, the oneness behind all seeming, all differences. And so it is not absurd to experience happiness in a world of suffering. We need to express that happiness appropriately. And if we can seek that happiness in the happiness of others, then that expands and moves us away from the intensity of the duality between happiness and sorrow. For this we were born. All right, be happy.